When we last left off on Banned Throughout the Ages, we had just finished covering the May 2002 Forbidden and Limited list, and its respective format. On that list, we saw the semi-limitation of card destruction, Swords of Revealing Light, as well as the limitation of the 5 pieces of Exodia, Raigeki, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, and Pot of Greed. We now continue our venture throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh's Forbidden and Limited list, progressively covering every single ban list till we reach the most recent one. I'll be your host, Topsy Turnip, and this is Banned Throughout the Ages. July 1st, 2002 marked the release of the second ever Forbidden and Limited list for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. It took no more than 2 months for Konami to decide that the game needed some more rebalancing. But what exactly occurred between the release of the first and second ban list? Well, during that time in between, we had another booster pack set be released in the TCG, that being Booster Pack Metal Raiders. Metal Raiders was the second main booster set released in the TCG. This set was released on June 26, 2002, and brought a plethora of very impactful and powerful cards into the game, and these new cards would have a significant impact towards the developing meta. Some of the high impact makers for this set included, but was not limited to, Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, Magician of Faith, Dark Elf, 7-Color Fish, Mirror Force, Heavy Storm, and many more. Before getting into what exactly got hit on this ban list, I want to take a quick minute to talk about this format as a whole, and give some background and understanding as to why some of the cards later on in the video received the limitations that they did. Now then, when talking about Metal Raiders and the significance it had towards the game, I'd say that the most significant feature of this set was the introduction of new and interesting effect monsters added to the card pool. Monsters that would add a bit more complexity and diversity to the game. Well, at least when compared to LOB format and the stealth deck diversity it offered, where every deck you would face would be essentially the same deck with maybe 5 to 10 cards being different from each other. Don't get me wrong, while you would continue seeing many decks this format play a significant number of the same cards, it would be different from LOB format since the cards that they would share amongst each other would be the staples of the format, like the Power 5 that we had discussed about in our last video. As I mentioned before, Metal Raiders introduced a lot of new, interesting, and powerful cards to the game, and a few of those cards would go on to warp the format as a whole. No card better exemplifies this point than the format's very own mascot, Sangan. I say mascot since this format was referred to as Critter format by the community, an homage to Sangan's Japanese name. But what exactly made this little guy so impactful? Sangan and its partner in crime, Witch of the Black Forest, were essentially the backbone of this format. These two cards are the main culprits for the deck diversity that you would find if you were to play Critter format. Thanks to these two meta warping cards, we saw many strategies emerge, ranging all the way from heavy aggro decks where they would utilize monsters such as Jiraiya and Dark Elf to overwhelm their opponent with huge monsters, all the way to slow control decks like Mass Control, where they would play cards like Robin Goblin and Mass Sorcerer to whittle the opponent's hand down and at the same time draw more and more cards to out-advantage the opponent. But I digress. Let's discuss what the meta actually looked like during Critter format. Critter format had a lot of removal running about, with cards like Raigeki, Dark Hole, you name it. There was so much of it. But we also had Witch and Sangan, which balanced it out a bit. Essentially, playing control decks became the meta call due to the amount of field destruction present, and because defensive monsters were very strong. All this made Critter format primarily an advantage-oriented format. Now that we have some background on Critter format and just how Metal Raiders affected it, let's move on to the ban list. The July 1st, 2002 ban list is minuscule when you compare it to our last ban list. This list had a grand total of 4 cards hit, 3 of them being semi-limited, and the last one being just limited to 1. With all that out of the way, let's get to breaking down this ban list, with the first 2 cards on our list. Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest are 2 incredibly powerful cards that are referred to as the backbone of Critter format. Now then, let's have a read of each of these cards to see what exactly they do. We'll go ahead and start off with Sangan first. When this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, move 1 monster with 1500 attack or less from your deck to your hand. Your deck is then shuffled. And now for Witch. When this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, move 1 monster with 1500 defense or less from your deck to your hand. Your deck is then shuffled. Alright then, so after reading those 2 cards, I'm sure we can all see as to why I refer to them as the backbone of the format. But if you still can't see as to why I refer to them as that, let's break it down. Essentially, Sengan and Witch allowed players to build almost any deck they wanted to, due to the versatility they had with searching almost every card in the game. You see, I say this since a common trope Konami had with their monsters for a very long time was, whenever they were printing a monster with a high attack stat, they would usually try and balance it by giving a low defense stat, and vice versa. If they gave you a monster with a high defense stat, it usually came with a low attack stat. For the most part, this was the trend. Ultimately, the introduction of these two cards pretty much made it obsolete to play monsters that did not fall within their searching thresholds. Alright, big whoop. They can search a monster when they leave the field. That can't be the only reason why these cards got semi-limited, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, the card's good, but just how unfair is it to search a monster in these early stages of the game? Fantastic question, commenter I just made up. Let's go ahead and zone in on what they could search exactly. As I mentioned before, these two cards combined could pretty much search you almost every monster in the card pool. But one specific monster I feel like might have made it a little too problematic of a search engine, and that card would be Magician of Fate, and to maybe a lesser extent, Mask of Darkness as well. So Magician of Fate and Mask of Darkness are two flip effect monsters that share essentially the same effect, but with one fundamental difference. Let's go ahead and have a read of each of them to get an understanding. We'll start off with Magician of Fate first, which reads, Flip, target one spell in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. And now for Mask of Darkness, of course. Flip, target one trap card in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. Now then, if you watched the last installment of Banned Throughout the Ages, then you should remember that we covered the Power 5 spells, and just how unbelievably powerful they were. Arguably the most powerful cards from all of LOB. Well, these 5 cards were so powerful that Konami deemed it necessary to have all 5 of them be limited to 1 copy per deck. Do you see where I'm getting at with this? Having Sengan and Witch both be able to search this card made it a bit unbalanced, since essentially at almost any point in the duel, you could just set either your Witch or your Sengan to then have it be destroyed, or you could just tribute over it in order to get your search of a Magician of Faith to recover one of those incredibly powerful spell cards like your Regeki, your Dark Hole, Pot of Greed, you name it. Any powerful spell that you had in your deck, Magician of Faith could just recover it back for you. And of course, same goes for Mask of Darkness, which had a smaller pool of powerful cards that it could recover. So some of the targets it could search back could be Trap Hole, Mirror Force, a new card introduced into the game, Seven Tools' Bandit, Solemn Judgment, all very powerful cards. So taking all that into consideration, it makes a bit more sense as to why Konami might have considered semi-limiting both Sengan and Witch. I mean, just imagine their thoughts after releasing these two powerful cards and thinking, oh shit, they can search almost anything. This probably made Konami very uncomfortable, since now if they ever want to release a powerful monster with an attack stat that fell within the searching range of Sengan and Witch, it could prove to be extraordinarily problematic. But that would never happen, right guys? Right? But let's move on for now. Onto something a little interesting. Some of the interactions Sengan and Witch had with some of the cards in the format. So if you remember when we read the cards, the way Witch and Sengan are worded pretty much makes it as to the monsters just have to hit the graveyard from the field in order for them to search your card. But why is that so important to bring up, you may ask? Well, let's take into consideration the time period we're in. Early Critter format had a shit ton of destruction running about, and also the idea of getting OTK'd was something that happened so seldomly that it was just a very unlikely situation to occur. So with this in mind, you could freely just set monsters without worrying about anything of the sort. But also, I did mention that there was a bit of a mind game that occurred during this format. Keeping this in mind, your opponent always had to be so very cognitive of when to use cards like Dark Hole and Regeki in order to clear a board, because if they were to use a card like Regeki and Dark Hole on a field of face-down monsters, they could 1. Benefit a lot by getting rid of those pesky flip effect monsters, or 2. Be extraordinarily punished by destroying multiple copies of Sengan or Witch and having you search multiple cards at the same time. So pretty much this interaction made Sengan and Witch extraordinarily annoying cards to deal with. Also, let's keep in mind that you could also tribute Witch or Sengan and get to search a monster you're pretty much going +1 in that interaction, which is incredible when you consider the time period we're in. Now that we've gotten to see just how much of an impact these cards had on the format, it begs the question, was their limitation warranted? And if so, was it enough? Personally, I agree with the move, but one thing I will say, I do think that Konami was a bit trigger happy with the limitation, since this was very early on in the game. The cards were yet to be truly problematic, and I think that they should have been allowed to flourish for a little longer at 3 copies per deck, since as I said before, these 2 cards were essentially just the glue that held together a lot of the fun decks that we would see come out of this format. And as I said before, while I think these cards would have been fine to be allowed to be played at 3 copies per deck for a bit longer, since they didn't inherently make any specific deck unfair to play against, in credit format that is, I can still understand Konami's reluctantness to allow these cards to be played at 3. All in all, I'd say that this limitation was okay. A bit trigger happy for my liking, but it was okay. And now on to our next card on the list, we have Heavy Storm. Alright boys, buckle up, cause next card up is Bonkers. So, Heavy Storm is a normal spell card with the effect Destroy all magic and trap cards on the field. That's it. So, with the introduction of this card, we finally received reliable spell and trap card removal in the game. A bit overkill if you ask me, nevertheless something very much welcome. Because keep in mind, before Heavy Storm was introduced, we had to rely on cards like Trap Master and Arm Ninja, or Dispel and Remove Trap in order to answer any pesky back row your opponent might have. So you bet your ass Yu-Gi-Oh players were happy to receive such a powerful card, right? I mean, no longer do you have to worry about the stall player just set 5 and have you deal with that amount of back row. And not to mention that Metal Raiders did introduce a lot of good trap cards as well. So the introduction of Heavy Storm was good, right? Well, you would think so. Here's the thing, Heavy Storm very quickly became a staple in the format and joined the ranks of the Power 5. Also, it changed the way people would play the game as well. You see, Heavy Storm heavily punished players that would recklessly overcommit on their back row. Now there was an actual punish to playing that way, and quickly players began to realize that they had to start playing the back row a lot more conservatively and weigh their choice as to what back row they want to set. This would essentially create a game of chicken between both players. On one side, one player will have to decide on just how much pressure they want to have. On the other side, you have the player with the Heavy Storm deciding when is it the most optimal choice to use it. Heavy Storm essentially became the Regeki / Dark Hole for back row removal. But unlike Regeki and Dark Hole during their prime in LOB, Metal Raiders actually provided a way to deal with this incredibly overpowered spell card. They did this by introducing 2 counter trap cards, one in Solemn Judgment and the other in Magic Jammer. 2 powerful trap cards, all things considered, that would essentially stop the activation of Heavy Storm, but at a price. Solemn Judgment and Magic Jammer, these 2 cards would see occasional play in decks, depending on how valuable their back row was to them. But in Solemn Judgment's case, it saw more play since it was more versatile than Magic Jammer. So it seems like Heavy Storm was fairly balanced, right? Well, not necessarily. As I stated before, while there was ways to deal with Heavy Storm, both of these cards that dealt with it, you had to pay a great deal to stop the activation of it. In Solemn Judgment's case, you had to pay half your life points. And I'm sure, we've all heard people say, life points don't matter, the only life point that matters is the last one, yada yada yada. But in these older formats, we kind of forget just how much of a resource life points actually were, since as I said before, you could survive multiple turns in these early formats, unlike in more modern Yu-Gi-Oh where it really doesn't matter because if you mess up anything, you're just gonna get OTK'd right away on the crackback. And this can be easily seen when you play these older formats. You would think that everyone would be playing cards like Solemn Judgment at 3 or Dark Elf at 3. These 2 cards are very powerful, but they have you pay a lot of life points in order to activate them. But let's move on to Magic Jammer. In Magic Jammer's case, you had to discard a card in order to negate the activation of a spell card. And it's the same case today as it was then. Hand advantage is incredibly important. And honestly, a case can be made that in older Yu-Gi-Oh, paying a cost like that was significantly harder. Since in these older formats, you never really want to get rid of any of the cards in your hand because it doesn't benefit you, unlike in more modern Yu-Gi-Oh, where the graveyard becomes a resource. So while cards existed to play around the Heavy Storm, they were not optimal choices in most cases. So was Konami then justified in the semi-limitation of this card? Well, simple answer, yes, but there's a lot of nuance to this answer. While it's true that Heavy Storm completely altered the way people played their back row, Heavy Storm was still a necessary evil for the format. With the existence of cards like Mirror Force running about in the format, a card like Heavy Storm was very much necessary to deal with these cards. Also, there needed to be some form of check for decks that would pretty much just sit on their copies of cards like Swords of Revealing Light to just whittle away at your resources. Also, as I mentioned before, this kept players a bit more honest with their back row. It wasn't uncommon to see players set random spells and traps in their back row just to bluff the potential of a trap hole or any card of the like. So with Heavy Storm running about, players that did that would end up getting screwed by that choice. To me, it seems that Konami was fully aware of just how powerful this card was, hence as to why it got semi-limited so fast. But at the same time, they realized that it was still necessary to deal with some of the cards being released. And in order to meet a happy medium, they went ahead and kept it at 2. Now for the final verdict. Was the semi-limitation of Heavy Storm deserved? Ultimately, yes. A card like Heavy Storm was incredibly powerful and extraordinarily punishing, but with the lack of back row destruction in the game, we needed something like it to be present. I believe that this card should have been placed to 1 copy per deck, the same way that Dark Hole and Regeki were placed on the list, but it makes more sense for it to be at 2 since Regeki and Dark Hole have 1 copy of each other, making it to where you technically have 2 monster board wipes. And it seems only fair if we had 2 copies of a card that could destroy all back row. So ultimately, kudos to Konami for deciding to semi-limit it as opposed to actually limiting the card. Alright, and with that we finished the semi-limited section. Lastly, all we have is the limited cards. As I mentioned before, we only have 1 card for the limited section. That 1 card is Mirror Force. Mirror Force is a normal trap card with the following effect. When an opponent's monster attacks, negate the attack and destroy all opponent's monsters in attack position. Oh, I'm sure we all have some fond memories of this card, playing back in the day with our friends in the schoolyard, where this card was one of the most punishing cards to be in the receiving end of. But let's go ahead and learn more about this card's impact on Critter format. Now then, as I mentioned before, Critter format revolved primarily around properly managing the resources and gaining the most advantage out of every card. This was what made Sengen and Witch such powerful staples of the format. But why am I mentioning all this in regards to Mirror Force? Well, the same case applied to this card. A lot like Sengen, Witch, and Heavy Storm, this card also fundamentally changed the way players played the game. Mirror Force affected the way players declared attacks, since players at all times had to play the game in a way where they wouldn't lose their entire field to a single Mirror Force activation. If anything, I'd say that Mirror Force was one of the main contributors to why control decks were so powerful during this period of time, since Mirror Force was incredibly punishing to all players who would overcommit and play extraordinarily aggro decks. Having a card that was essentially a Regeki on your opponent's turn was wild. This made players have to play significantly more carefully. And as I mentioned before, Mirror Force did change the way players entered the battle phase as well, since this made players have to decide what monsters they were willing to lose in the face of a Mirror Force. As I mentioned before, Mirror Force fundamentally changed the way players entered the battle phase, since at any moment in time, you had a looming Mirror Force waiting for you at the other end. So players had to pretty much decide what monsters they were okay with losing in which was they weren't, having them place some monsters in defense mode as opposed to attack mode, in order to keep their field from being completely wiped. But just how strong was that actually? From the sounds of it, it just seems like it's a slower version of Raigeki, since you have to activate it on your opponent's turn. Well, it's a little deceiving, you see. If we want to get down to super simplified terms, then I suppose yes, it is a weaker version of Raigeki, but make no mistakes, this card was not anything to be toyed with. This card saw immediate play. Pretty much every player that had access to it played it in their deck, because of just how powerful it was. Mass monster destruction is always good, given that it has an easy activation of course, because keep in mind, during this period of time, we still saw cards like Fissure and Trap Hole be played, and it's easy to see as to why Mirror Force would also be played right out of the gate. But one part I want to focus on is the fact that it activates on your opponent's turn. You see, this part of the card is very important to take note of, since in these early stages of the game, whenever your opponent commits to a summon of any sorts, if you were to Mirror Force them, likely chances are that you might just run away with the duel at that point, since at that point they can't summon anymore. And also, unlike Raigeki and Dark Hole, Mirror Force only destroys the face-up attack position monsters, so when you activate it, you know exactly what you're destroying, meaning that a card like Witch and Sangan are less likely to punish you in destroying them, unlike Dark Hole and Raigeki, which can destroy monsters that are even in face-down defense position where you don't know what they are at all. But I digress. Essentially, as I said, Mirror Force was just Raigeki as a trap card, and letting any form of Raigeki or Dark Hole running loose in the format was just unacceptable. Letting these type of cards be played at more than just one copy per deck would create some extraordinarily one-sided matches, and force players to play through multiple mass removal effects, which was not easy whatsoever in these early stages of the game. And not only that, but as I mentioned before, Mask of Darkness and Magician of Fate were cards that existed in the format, which meant that these incredibly powerful board wipes could keep being recycled and used over and over again, based on the amount of copies of these flip monsters that you played. Honestly, this is the limitation that I agree with the most on Konami's side. The limitation of this card was for the best for the game. Since we already had Dark Hole and Raigeki both at 1, it only made sense that Mirror Force would join these powerful cards alongside them. Mass removal effects were just too powerful in these formats, and with the lack of graveyard effects, there was very little drawback to using these cards. So all in all, Konami was right on the money with this limitation, and good riddance to that card. Alright guys, and with that, we've covered the July 2002 Forbidden and Limited list. A shorter list compared to our last one, but with some very impactful hits. And if you did enjoy the video, consider leaving a like and maybe subscribing as well. Also, stay tuned for the next installment of Banned Throughout the Ages, where we're going to be covering the October 2002 Forbidden and Limited list. And with that, I've been your host, Topsy Turnip. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.